After 22 years of military service, I watched my daughter-in-law throw my medals in the trash on Thanksgiving morning. Nobody wants this old junk on the table. She sneered. My son stood silent. I didn't yell. I just smiled, pulled out my phone, and took one photo of the garbage can. By the next morning, she was frantically packing her suitcase, her face whiter than snow. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Leonard Wells. I'm 66 years old, and I've lived at 1412 Maple Street in Nashville, Tennessee for the past 19 years, spent 31 of those years working for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, inspecting cargo, reading manifests, watching people's faces when they had something to hide, retired 14 months ago with a federal pension, a bad knee from standing on concrete floors half my life, and a habit of noticing things other people walk right past. My neighbors would probably call me quiet. My former colleagues would use a different word, patient. Maybe. The kind of patient that makes people nervous once they finally figure out what I've been watching. The room at the end of my upstairs hallway has no bed. No dresser. No television. Floor-to-ceiling shelves and old maps. A Tennessee state survey from 1847 that cost me $3. Estate sale, a hand-drawn coastal chart from the Carolinas. Circa 1791. That took 3 years to authenticate. Some people collect regrets. I collect maps because old maps are honest in a way people rarely are. They show exactly where the land hides its secrets, where the routes that look direct on paper will tear you open if you follow them. I spent my career reading hidden routes. Turns out the skill transfers. My daughter Julie is 34. She has her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which used to make me proud, until about 2 years ago. She called every Sunday evening without fail, sometimes a 5-minute call about nothing. What she'd cooked, whether I'd fixed the gutter, sometimes an hour. I never told her those calls were the best part of my week. I'm not built for that kind of confession. But they were. Then she married Terry Boyd. Terry is 38 and looks like the kind of man who was voted most likely to succeed in high school and has been reminding people of it ever since. Claims to run a commercial construction business. Always has a project in progress. Always has a deal closing. Always has a reason the money is tied up right now, but will be liquid soon. He shook my hand with both of his when we met and called me Leonard. Not Mr. Wells. Not sir. Like he was doing me a favor. I smiled and passed him the bread. The changes in Julie came gradually enough that you could almost convince yourself nothing was changing. She called less. Then less again. When I reached out, she'd answer. But her voice had a flatness to it. Careful. Measured. Like someone reading from a script they'd memorized but hadn't written. Once I called on a Tuesday evening and Terry picked up her phone. Said she was in the shower and would call back. She didn't call that night. She called the next morning while he was at work. I later realized the call lasted 4 minutes. I spent 3 decades watching people at border crossings. I know the difference between someone who's busy and someone who's being monitored. Her birthday came and went. I mailed a card and a check for $500. The check cleared in 2 days. She texted a thank you emoji. No call. My own birthday arrived in September. I'd set a place at the table out of habit, just in case she showed up the way she used to. With a grocery bag and whatever she decided to cook, she texted at 9:30. Sorry. Dead. Crazy week. Rain check. First time in 34 years, she hadn't reached out in any meaningful way on my birthday. A text message at 9:30. Like a notification from an app. I sat at that empty table for a long time. Then I put the plate away, washed the dishes, and went upstairs to the map room. Stood in front of the 1847 Tennessee survey. There's a swamp south of the Cumberland River with a note in faded ink from the cartographer. Do not attempt without guide. I thought about Terry Boyd's double-handed handshake. 3 weeks later, I called to invite them for Christmas. Terry answered. Varm. Easy. That practiced friendliness. That costs him nothing, because it means nothing. Of course will come. Leonard. Julie's been looking forward to it. I waited for her to take the phone. He kept talking, filling the space with a new project near Brentwood. Serious money. The kind of deal that changes everything. I've noticed that men who are hiding things fill silence aggressively. Like noise is a kind of camouflage. Julie never came to the phone. I said I'd have dinner at 6 and hung up. 2 weeks before Christmas, I was at the Kroger on Gallatin Pike, debating 2 overpriced cuts of beef when a woman nearby apologized for reaching past me. I looked up and recognized Brenda Cole, Julie's coworker. We'd met twice at a company picnic. She usually carries herself with easy confidence. She wasn't carrying it now. She looked at me the way people look at someone who doesn't yet know about a car accident, pity and reluctance in equal measure. "Mr. Wells," she said quietly, actually glancing around before she stepped closer. "Do you know what's been going on at home with Julie?" I set the beef down. My knee ached. The fluorescent lights hummed. "Tell me," I said. Brenda talked for 11 minutes in the condiments aisle. Low and fast. The way people speak when they've been carrying something too long. Terry took Julie's phone every night. Not to charge it, but to review it. Message. Call history. Email. If she'd spoken to anyone he hadn't approved of, there'd be a conversation later. He'd capped her debit card at $200 a week and tracked every transaction. Receipts required for anything he didn't recognize. She couldn't stay late at work without advance notice. You couldn't take lunch with coworkers unless he knew who. She came in one morning, Brenda said, and stopped. She looked at the card handle. She had marks on her wrist from fingers. Said she'd bumped into a door frame. I kept my face exactly where I wanted it. 31 years of practice. I asked 2 specific questions. The kind you ask when you need information. Not comfort, then thanked her. I bought 2 things I didn't need and drove home at the speed limit. I sat in my driveway for 11 minutes before going inside. A specific memory surfaced while I sat there with the engine off. A Sunday afternoon about 4 years earlier. Before the engagement, Julie had come to help reorganize the map room. We'd ordered pizza and sat on the floor surrounded by rolled linen and acetate sleeves. She pointed at the 1,791 coastal chart and asked what the small symbols along the shoreline meant. Depth soundings. I told her. The cartographer had sent someone out in a rowboat, measuring foot by foot. So any ship following that chart would know exactly where the bottom would rise and tear them open. That's a lot of work just to help strangers. She said, that's the whole point of a map. I told her. She gave me her slightly crooked smile, the one I'd been reading since she was 3. That afternoon it meant she was exactly where she wanted to be. I hadn't seen that smile in 2 years. The next morning, I drove to 333 Commerce Street and took the elevator to the 5th floor. Rebecca Simmons had been expecting me. I'd spent several evenings doing preliminary research before making any move. Family law attorney, specializing in domestic financial abuse. 18 years in practice. I paid $1. $400 for the initial consultation and the first documentation steps. She was direct. I appreciated that more than she knew. Without a statement from Julie, there's no criminal case to build right now. She has to initiate that herself. Understood. But there are other avenues. In cases involving financial control, there are often separate legal exposures that don't require Julie's participation to pursue. I asked what documentation would be most useful. She told me. I took notes in my spiral-bound notebook. Small blue cover. The same format since 1987. Back home. I got to work. There's a stillness that comes over me on a real problem. My old supervisor used to say, I looked more focused at hour 8 than hour 1. Not discipline. Closer to what a hunting dog feels when it locks onto a scent. Everything that isn't the target stops registering. I pulled up the Tennessee Secretary of State's Public Business Registry and typed in Terry Boyd. 3 LLCs, Boyd Construction LLC. Summit Builds LLC. Crest Contracting LLC. All active. I cross-referenced with the state's public contract database, the federal procurement system, and spent an hour in Pacer on associated civil filings. Boyd Construction LLC had received a $1.2 million commercial construction contract for a retail center near the airport. Terry's state business filing for that same fiscal year reported $180. 0 inches. Gross receipts. Isouthback, a man who earns $1, $2 million, and reports $180. 000 has not made an accounting error. He has made a decision, and that kind of decision leaves a trail because money always does. You can rename it, reroute it, bury it in invoices from companies that don't exist. But it's still moving, and moving things leave marks. I wrote at the top of a fresh page, Boyd case. What is he hiding? I ran the registered addresses of all 3 LLCs, Summit Builds LLC. A street in Murfreesboro, Crest Contracting LLC. The same address. I ran it through Tennessee's voter registration lookup public record and got a name back in seconds. Christine Boyd. Terry's mother. I set the pen down. 2 out of 3 shell companies registered to a 6-1-year-old woman who had never, I was certain, held a hammer on a commercial job site. He remembered Terry mentioning early on that his mother was very supportive of his business interests. Filed and forgotten at the time. Not anymore. I walked to the map room and stood in front of the 1847 survey. The swamp south of the Cumberland. The cartographer's warning. Do not attempt without guide. Terry had been operating on one assumption. That no one was looking. That a retired inspector with a house full of old maps was exactly what he appeared to be. Scenery. An obstacle to manage when the time came to pry the house loose. He was wrong about the maps. He was wrong about me. I went back to the desk and built the case file. 47 pages. Cross-referenced. Printed. Organized in a blue folder from the office supply store on Charlotte Pike. Documentation first. Strategy second. Movement last. I wrote Terry Boyd's name at the top of the first page and underlined it once. Then I made coffee and stood at the front window. Down the street. My neighbor Dennis Carter's porch light was on. We'd talked on evening walks. Played a few games of checkers over the years. He was reserved about his work. Federal government service. He'd said once. And hadn't elaborated. I'd respected that. I glanced at the blue folder sitting on my desk. A man in federal service living quietly on a Nashville side street might find certain financial documents professionally interesting. I thought about how to have that conversation without making it feel like a conversation at all. 3 weeks is a long time to spend at a desk. But I've spent longer. When I was working the primary inspection lane at the port, I once reviewed the same shipping manifest for 4 days before I found the discrepancy. A single line in a sub-listing that didn't match the weight on the exterior form. 4 days of looking at the same page. The agent who trained me said patience wasn't a virtue in this work. It was a method. You don't get tired of looking. You just keep looking until the thing you're looking for runs out of places to hide. Terry Boyd had a lot of places to hide. But he'd been hiding for long enough that he'd stopped being careful. The Tennessee Secretary of State's database is public record, which means anyone with a laptop and a working internet connection can pull it. What most people don't know is how to read what they're looking at. 3 LLCs. All active. All with registered agents and official addresses. All filed correctly with the state. On paper, they look like a functioning small business network. Boyd Construction does the prime contracting. Summit Builds handles materials procurement. Crest Contracting covers subcontracted labor. Clean. Organized. Sensible. Except Summit Builders had no registered employees. Crest Contracting had filed a combined total of 11 W-2s over 3 years. For a company supposedly handling labor on a $1.2 million project. That number is roughly what you'd expect from a good-sized fast food restaurant. And both companies listed the same address in Murfreesboro. Same address. Different names. Same address. I spent 2 evenings cross-referencing the contract award records from the state's procurement database with the federal FPDS system. Boyd Construction, LLC had received a total of $2.1 million in contract awards over the past 3 fiscal years. I then pulled Terry's personal state tax filings, also public record through the Tennessee Department of Revenue for registered business entities, and found reported gross income across all 3 entities totaling $430. 000 for the same period. Armaven, $1,430,000. 000, reported. I sat with that for a while. I've seen creative accounting before. Cargo manifests that listed machine parts and turned out to contain something else entirely. Bills of lading that listed origin ports that didn't match the shipping routes. The mechanism was always different. The math always told the same story. I cross-checked the Murfreesboro address through the Pacer civil records system and found that a woman named Christine Boyd, listed as managing member of both Summit Builders LLC and Crest Contracting LLC, had received payments totaling $74,000 over 3 years, categorized as consulting fees. I wrote the number down, circled it, put a question mark next to it, though I already knew it wasn't really a question. What I had at the end of 3 weeks was 47 pages. I printed everything and organized it by category. Contract awards on top, corporate filings in the middle, payment records at the back. I used a blue folder I'd bought at the office supply store on Charlotte Pike, the same kind I used at work for years. There's something clarifying about a well-organized case file. It takes everything that feels large and complicated and makes it into a thing you can hold in 2 hands. I held it in 2 hands for a moment. Then I put it under my arm and went for a walk. The evening air in Nashville in late November has a particular quality. Cold, but not sharp. The kind of cold that makes you want to keep moving. I walked the length of Maple Street at a deliberate pace. Dennis Carter's porch light was on. I'd timed the walk for this. Dennis and I had exchanged perhaps 100 conversations over 4 years. Weather. Sports. The ongoing saga of the pothole at the corner of Maple and Birch that the city had been promising to fix since the previous spring. He was private about his work, which I respected because I understood it. Federal government. He'd said once, left it there. He was checking his mailbox when I came level with his driveway. Evening. Dennis. I said, Leonard. He closed the mailbox. Noticed the folder under my arm. I didn't ask about it. I held it out. I have something that might interest you, I said, professionally. Not as a neighbor. As a professional. He looked at the folder for a moment, then he took it. I'll take a look, he said. 3 days passed. On the morning of the 4th day, I was drinking coffee at the kitchen table when I heard a knock. Dennis stood on my front step in a dark jacket, the blue folder in his hand. His expression was the one I recognized from my career. The look of someone who has confirmed something they suspected but hoped was wrong. Leonard, he said. Where did you get this? Public records, I said. Tennessee Secretary of State. Federal Procurement Database. Baser. Everything in there is accessible to anyone who knows where to look. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to need to open a formal review. I understand. This takes time. Minimum a month before anything moves officially. He paused. And you can't say anything to Boyd. Nothing that would indicate there's a review underway. Nothing at all. I've kept quieter than this for 31 years. I said. He looked at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. He tucked the folder under his arm. I'll be in touch through the box, he said. I nodded. He walked back down the front path. I went inside, poured more coffee, and sat down at my desk. I opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top. Phase 2. Then I thought about Christmas. 5 weeks away. And about the fact that Terry Boyd had no idea that the last time he sat at my table, the clock had already started. A week before Christmas. Terry called. I was in the map room when my phone buzzed on the windowsill. His name on the screen. I let it ring once. Set down the magnifying glass I'd been using to examine a detail on the 1,791 coastal chart, and answered on the second ring. Leonard. The warmth in his voice was the kind you could bottle and sell. Just confirming Christmas dinner. We're still on for the 25th. Right. Lou Lin. Of course, I said, looking forward to it. Great. A pause. I knew what was coming. One thing. My mother, Christine, is in town for the holidays. I hope it's all right if she joins us. She's been so wanting to meet Julie's family. I let a beat pass. The way you do when you want to seem like you're genuinely considering something. Absolutely. The more the merrier. Wonderful. She's really excited. He said a few more things. Something about the weather. Something about a project. And then said goodbye in the way he always did. As though he was conferring a small gift by ending the conversation. I set the phone down and opened my notebook to the page marked Boyd case. I wrote, Christine Boyd, confirm LLC address. Murfreesboro. Then I thought for a moment and added, check all 3 registrations against her residential address. I already knew what I'd find because I'd found it 3 weeks earlier. But I wanted it written down in the sequence it happened. The way I always kept case notes. Chronological. Specific. Nothing assumed. The note I left for Dennis the next morning was brief. I wrote it on a plain index card. No envelope. Christine Boyd listed as managing member. Summit Builds LLC and Crest Contracting LLC. Both registered to 2244 Clearwater Drive, Murfreesboro. TN. Residential address. I put it in the mailbox at 60 inches the morning before anyone on the street was moving and raised the flag. By afternoon, the flag was down and the box was empty. That same evening I tried calling Julie. This was the 4th attempt in as many weeks. The first 3 had gone to voicemail. This time she answered on the 3rd ring. And something about the quality of the connection told me immediately that she was somewhere small. A bathroom. Maybe. Or a closet. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Dad. Not a greeting. More like a confirmation. Julie. I kept my voice the way you keep a hand steady when you're carrying something that can't be spilled. How are you? Fine. A pause. Everything's fine. Are you coming Christmas? I'll be there. I said, my table, my house, Lo Ling Ling. I heard her exhale, long and slow. The way you breathe when something you've been bracing against doesn't hit you. Okay, she said. Good. Then, quieter. Dad. Just come. Okay, just come. Her voice had that particular quality I'd been trying not to think about for weeks. Not fear. Exactly. Something more worn than fear. The tone of a person who has learned to manage their expressions so carefully that even their relief comes out muted. Like they're not sure they're allowed to feel it fully. I'll be there. I said again. She said goodbye quickly. I held the phone for a moment after the call ended. Then I went to the kitchen and started thinking about the dinner. I've cooked Christmas dinner alone for 14 years. I know exactly what I'm making. Pot roast with carrots and pearl onions. Mashed potatoes. A green bean dish with almonds that Julie has liked since she was 9. Nothing complicated. Nothing that requires my full attention. Which was exactly what I needed this particular evening. I set the table a full day early because I wanted to see it. 6 chairs. 4 matching dining chairs and 2 from the study. My place at the head, the chair to my immediate right with a good cloth napkin from the sideboard. And next to that plate, a second napkin, plain. White. Just there. I don't know precisely when I decided to put out that second napkin. It wasn't part of a plan. More of an instinct, the same instinct that made me. During inspections, I put an extra manifest copy in my back pocket before approaching a container I had a feeling about. You bring what you might need. You don't always know why until you need it. Dennis knocked on Christmas Eve at 7:30. He stepped inside far enough that we weren't visible from the street. We're set, he said quietly. Everything's in order. I nodded. You invited me for tomorrow. Not quite a question. As my neighbor, I said, 4 years on this street and I've never had you for Christmas dinner. Seemed like an oversight. He held my gaze for a moment. In his line of work, as in mine, you develop a sensitivity to people who are telling you the technical truth while the real meaning lives in the space around it. He knew exactly what I was doing. What time, he asked. Lo Ling Ling. I said, Potrost. One nod. He left. I watched him walk back down the street with his hands in his pockets. Nothing in his posture that would look like anything to anyone watching. I went back to the kitchen and finished the prep work. While I worked, I ran through the sequence in my head the way I used to run through inspection procedures. Each step, each contingency, each variable identified and accepted. You can't control everything. You control your preparation, your documentation, and where you stand when things start moving. I knew where I was going to stand. People like Terry Boyd always give you the moment themselves. The same confidence that makes them effective also makes them unable to resist the room they think they own. All you have to do is set the table and wait. They arrived at 6:00 exactly, which told me something about Terry Boyd right away. A man who wants to impress you is early. A man who wants to control you is exactly on time. He decides when the evening begins. I heard the car in the driveway and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment before going to the door. The roast had been resting for 20 minutes. The table was set. Dennis Carter was already seated in the chair nearest the window, a glass of water in front of him, wearing a dark blue sweater and the expression of a man who is excellent at appearing to be somewhere for no particular reason. I opened the front door. Terry was already smiling. The full version of it, the one that occupied his whole face but stopped somewhere short of his eyes. He was wearing a charcoal sport coat over a dark shirt. No tie. The kind of calculated casual that announces itself without intending to. He reached out and took my hand with both of his. Leonard. He stepped inside. Great to see you. The place looks... He glanced at the walls, the staircase, the hallway leading to the map room, and let a small pause do the work his words didn't have to. Exactly the same. Some things don't need changing. I said. Christine Boyd came in behind him. She's 61. Well-maintained in the way that requires consistent effort and money. With a posture that communicates she is accustomed to rooms adjusting themselves for her arrival, she looked at the living room, then toward the hallway, and her gaze landed on the open door of the map room. The way a person's gaze finds a mess they weren't expecting. Oh, she said. She stepped toward the doorway and looked in at the shelves. This is your collection. Maps, I said. 17th through 19th century. Mostly. She tilted her head at a framed piece near the door. The 1791 coastal chart, which happens to be insured for $6. Sube, they're old, she said, with a tone of a compliment that had been slightly misdirected. Are they worth anything? Some of them, I said, more than they look. She made a small sound that could have meant several things and turned back toward the dining room. Julie came in last. She was wearing a gray cardigan over dark slacks, and her hair was pulled back, which she only does when she's trying to take up less space. She crossed the threshold like someone who had rehearsed the movement. Deliberate. Contained. Each gesture controlled. She looked at me, and for a moment I saw the effort it took for her expression not to change. Dad, she said. I put my hand briefly on her shoulder. The green beans are on the stove, I said. They need another minute. It was nothing. It was exactly the right thing. We sat down. We ate. The roast was good. Christine spent the first 20 minutes discussing a charity auction she'd attended, and I listened with the attentiveness I once gave to cargo manifests. I was fairly certain were fraudulent, noting everything, showing nothing. Terry talked about a project. He always had a project. This one involved a mixed-use development, a subcontracting opportunity, capital in the low 7 figures. He was describing it to me, but he was watching Dennis while he did it. Dennis was the unknown variable at the table, and Terry had clocked it. He was trying to figure out what kind of person Dennis was, what he did, whether he mattered. Standard procedure for a man who sorts everyone into categories before he sits down. What do you do? Dennis Christine asked with the relaxed tone of someone who expected to be the most interesting person in the answer. 2. Government work. Dennis said. Federal level. Mostly paperwork. He said it the way only someone who does the opposite of paperwork can say it convincingly. Said Christine and returned to her food. Julie ate about a third of what was on her plate. She spoke when spoken to and answered every question with something technically resembling a full sentence. Terry touched her hand once. A small gesture. Possessive rather than affectionate. The kind that says, I see you, rather than I care about you. She didn't react. That's what 2 years of conditioning looks like from the outside. Midway through the main course, I stood up. Gravi, I said, left it on the stove. I walked to the kitchen. I heard the chair scrape behind me. Julie, following. In 2 years. She had apparently been trained not to let me be alone in a room with her. Tonight, the habit was working in my favor. She came into the kitchen and stopped 3 feet from me. I had my back to her. Reaching for the gravy boat, I heard a small sound from behind the counter. A drawer, a napkin holder, then silence. I turned around. She was holding out a white napkin, the pen from the junk drawer, the one that's lived in the same spot for 11 years. The letters were small and slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone writing quickly without looking down. He locked the door. I can't get out. I looked at the napkin. I looked at her face. She wasn't crying. Her expression was the specific kind of control that develops when showing feeling has consequences. But her eyes were her mother's eyes. And in her mother's eyes, I could always read what the rest of the face was working hard to hide. I took the napkin from her hand. She turned and walked back toward the dining room without a word. I stood in the kitchen. I counted 4 seconds. I looked at the napkin, at the handwriting I'd known since she was 7 years old. Learning cursive at the kitchen table 12 feet from where I was standing. I folded the napkin once and placed it in the breast pocket of my shirt, against my chest. Then I picked up the gravy boat and walked back to the table. Sorry about that, I said, setting it down. Forgot to transfer it earlier. No trouble, said Terry and smiled and reached for the gravy. The rest of the main course passed. Christine asked Dennis about Nashville's development potential. Terry described his project in slightly more detail than before. Watching for my reaction. Receiving appropriate nods at appropriate intervals. I have maintained a more convincing neutral expression sitting across from people who were actively moving contraband through my checkpoint. So this required no effort whatsoever. Dennis ate slowly and said very little. At the end of the main course, Terry refilled his own glass and lifted it. I want to make a toast. He looked around the table with the warmth of a man who believed this room was already his. To family and to the future. He looked at me when he said future. It was a very specific look. The look of a man who has already made a decision and is letting you know he's being gracious about it. I raised my glass. To the future, I said, and I thought, yes, exactly that. Dessert was apple pie from the bakery on Gallatin Pike. I bought it 2 days earlier because I don't bake and have never pretended otherwise. Christine had half a slice. Terry had a full piece and leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man settling into something he already considers his. He let a few minutes pass. The comfortable silence after a meal. The kind where people are deciding whether to have more coffee or start looking for reasons to leave. Christine made a comment about the drive back to Murfreesboro. Then Terry said it. You know, Leonard. Warm. Careful. The voice of someone raising a topic they've already settled on. Julia and I were talking the other day about this house. A pause. Letting it land. It's a lot of space for one person. Upstairs. The map room taking up most of the second floor. All that maintenance. He tilted his head slightly. A gesture of consideration. We were thinking it might make sense to simplify something smaller. More manageable. Free up the equity. A place like this. In this neighborhood. He gestured at the walls. You're sitting on close to $400. Ling, ling, ling. He said it like he was doing me a favor. The way a man hands you a chair, he's already decided to take. Christine set her fork down delicately, deliberately, and added, It's very practical at your age. My neighbor did exactly that. Moved into a lovely senior community. Much less maintenance. Much less stress. At your age, said with the tone of someone who wants the effect of the phrase and the cover of sounding reasonable, I didn't answer immediately. I looked at my plate. I looked at the fork resting on the rim of it. The good silverware. The wedding gift set, 40 years old and still without a scratch on it. I reached down and set the fork flat against the plate. The sound it made. Metal on porcelain. Small and precise in the silence that had settled. Carried across the table. Everyone heard it. I looked at Terry Boyd. Dennis. I said, I think you might have some questions. 6 words. Level. Calm. No inflection. The simplest sentence for the thing that needed saying. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then Dennis set his napkin on the table. He reached into the inner pocket of his sweater. Not a jacket. A sweater. Which is part of why no one at the table had thought anything of it. And brought out a credential wallet. He opened it flat on the table. The golden blue of the IRS criminal investigation seal caught the light from the overhead fixture. He stood up. His voice changed entirely. Not louder. Lower. The specific register of official authority. Level. Measured. No warmth and no hostility. Just the weight of institution behind every syllable. Terry Boyd. I'm Special Agent Dennis Carter with IRS Criminal Investigation. I have questions regarding Boyd Construction LLC, Summit Builds LLC, and Crest Contracting LLC. A pause of exactly the right duration. You have the right to have an attorney present. The table went quiet the way a room goes, quiet when something structural fails. Not a crash, but a sudden absence of the sound you'd stop noticing. Christine made a sound. Not a word. Something involuntary. A small, compressed exhalation. As though someone had pressed a hand flat against her sternum. Her fork left her fingers and rang against the rim of her plate before sliding to the tablecloth. She stared at Dennis. Then she looked at her son. Her face had the particular blankness of a person whose internal calculations are moving faster than her expression can manage. I watched her with what I would describe as professional interest. Terry stood up. Or he tried to. What actually happened was that he rose about halfway and his legs did not cooperate. He grabbed the edge of the table, a quick, unplanned motion, and steadied himself. He was upright, but the grab had happened, and everyone at the table had seen it. His face was a study in competing systems. The professional smile was still present, a residual expression. The way a room stays bright for a moment after you've turned off the lamp. Underneath it, something else entirely. His color had shifted from the practiced warmth of a man who spends time in front of mirrors to something closer to the tablecloth beneath his hands. His mouth opened. He looked at Dennis, then at me, then at Dennis again. He started. The sentence didn't come. His jaw moved without producing anything further. In 2 years of watching Terry Boyd operate, I had never once seen him at a loss for a sentence. The silence from him now had a different quality than ordinary silence. It was the silence of a man whose entire system of control had just been unplugged, and who hadn't yet processed what that meant for every assumption he'd built on top of it. I picked up my coffee cup and took a sip. Julie had not moved. She was sitting perfectly still, both hands flat on the tablecloth in front of her, and she was looking at me with an expression. It took me a moment to place because I hadn't seen it in 2 years. It was the slightly crooked look of someone who has just understood that what they thought was a cliff edge is actually a staircase, and that someone built it while they weren't looking. Terry, Dennis said. Still even. Still precise. I'd like to speak with you in the other room. It was phrased as a preference. It was not one. Terry's hands were still flat on the edge of the table. He looked at them as if he wasn't certain how they'd gotten there. He straightened slowly and smoothed the front of his jacket with a gesture that was, for the first time in my experience of him, entirely automatic. Not performed, not calibrated, just the reflex of a man trying to find something familiar to hold on to. Of course, he said. His voice was lower than before. The performance was still audible in it, but it had gone wrong somewhere. Like a familiar song played at the wrong tempo. You can still recognize the melody, but something is fundamentally off. He walked toward the living room. Dennis followed. The door to the living room didn't close fully. A warping in the frame I've never gotten around to fixing, and I could hear, without making any effort at all. The shift in Dennis's tone from conversational to formal. Christine had not spoken since her fork dropped. She sat with her hands in her lap, looking at nothing specific on the far wall. Her expression had settled into something careful and distant. The expression of a woman doing rapid and private arithmetic. She was, I found, more interesting to watch than her son. Terry's panic was straightforward. Christine's was disciplined. She was already thinking about what came after this evening. I made a note of that. Julie looked at me across the table. I looked back at her. The pie's still good. I said, "If you want another slice." Her face did something complicated. Her eyes filled briefly. Not from sadness, I thought, but from the specific pressure of a feeling that has been compressed for a long time and has just found space to exist in. She pressed her lips together. She nodded once. Very slightly. I cut her a slice. I refilled my coffee. From the living room came the sound of Dennis's voice. Steady and official. Asking the first of what I understood would be a considerable number of questions. I sat at the head of my table in the house I had built with my own hands. On Maple Street in Nashville, Tennessee. And I thought about a line I'd once read in the margin of an 18th century coastal chart. The surveyor had written, "The land here deceives. What appears solid is not. What appears impassable has a way through." Terry Boyd had spent 2 years walking on land he thought was solid. I had spent 3 months finding the way through. Dennis and Terry were in the living room for 40 minutes. I know because I washed the dishes. I've washed dishes slowly before. It's a useful thing to do when you need to be somewhere without appearing to be waiting for something. I ran the water warm. Worked through the plates and glasses, one at a time. Dried each one completely before setting it down. The sound from the living room was mostly Dennis, steady, unhurried. The tone of a man who has conducted several hundred of these conversations and finds no drama in them whatsoever. Julie came and stood beside me. She didn't say anything at first. She picked up a dish towel and started drying the glasses I'd already set aside, which didn't need drying. And we stood there together at the sink, the way we used to when she was 12, and helping me clean up after Sunday dinners. After a while, I heard a sound beside me that wasn't the water or the dishes. I looked over. She wasn't sobbing. It wasn't that. It was quieter than that. The kind of crying that has learned to be small, that's been compressed into something that takes up almost no space. Her eyes were wet, and her mouth was pressed shut. And her hands were still moving the towel over the glass in steady circles. Like if she just kept doing the task, it would hold everything else in place. I turned off the faucet. I dried my hands. I didn't say anything for a moment. "You're not in trouble," I said. She nodded. It wasn't clear whether she believed me yet. "None of what's happening tonight touches you," I said. I made sure of that. Another nod. The glass in her hands, the towel moving in its careful circles. Christine had gone to the far end of the living room when Dennis began his questions with Terry and had not moved since. When Dennis finished, he came to the kitchen doorway and gave me a look. I recognized the look of a man who has confirmed what he expected to confirm and now has work to do. He said that a formal summons would arrive within 2 weeks. He thanked me for dinner, shook Yuli's hand, nodded to Christine without warmth, and left. Terry came out of the living room looking like a man who'd been asked to stand in a cold wind for 40 minutes without being told when it would stop. His jaw was set. He was doing the work of reassembling the expression. I could see it happening the way a person straightens their clothing after they've been caught off balance. He went straight to Christine without looking at me or Julie, and said 2 quiet words I didn't catch. She stood and gathered her coat. He paused at the dining room doorway on his way out. He looked at me. His eyes had gone flat. Not blank, not empty, but the particular flatness of a man deciding what kind of threat he wants to make without having decided how much of a threat he's actually in a position to make. "We'll talk," he said. "Take your time." I said. They left. I heard the car start in the driveway. I heard it back out and drive away down Maple Street. Julie and I sat in the living room. I didn't put on the television. I didn't light a lamp, just the one already on. The side table one, that gives the room a low, even light. She sat in the chair where Dennis had been. I sat across from her. "Rebecca Simmons," I said. "She's on Commerce Street downtown. 5th floor. She specializes in exactly this situation. I've paid the first retainer. Armayuan. eBay. After that, it's your decision whether to continue." Julie looked at her hands. "You did all of this," she said. "Not a question. Not accusation." More like someone reading back the last paragraph of a document to make sure they've understood it. "I had time," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Terry is going to say I was involved. He already implied it." He said that if anything ever came up about the business, I'd be named too because I'd signed something. Did you sign something? I asked. He put a document in front of me about 18 months ago. Said it was an insurance form. I didn't read it fully. I signed it. What was it? I don't know. Rebecca will know. I said, that's the first thing she checks. Julie was quiet for a moment longer. Then she nodded. Not to me specifically, but to some decision that had been forming for a while and had just settled. The next morning, she called Rebecca Simmons. I was in the map room when I heard her voice from the hallway. Low. Careful. But steady. She was on with Rebecca for 22 minutes. When she came to the doorway and told me she had an appointment the following week, the set of her face was different than it had been the evening before. Not lighter. Exactly. More resolved. Terry's response came 3 days later. Not to Julie directly, but through a letter from an attorney named Marcus Webb, whose office was in Brentwood. The letter stated that Julie Wells Boyd had been a signatory on corporate documents for Crest Contracting LLC and had material knowledge of business operations. It was carefully worded and entirely designed to do one thing: frighten her into backing away. I read it. I photographed it. I called Rebecca. He's fishing. Rebecca said when I described it, one signature on one document, obtained under duress. From a person with no business background or involvement. That's not exposure. That's a tactic. She didn't know what she was signing. I said, then we can establish that. I'll need to see the document. She paused. Has Julie spoken with anyone else who witnessed the circumstances? Anyone who knew what was happening at home? Yes. I said, I thought of Brenda Cole. Of the condiments aisle. Two of the look on her face when she'd stepped closer and lowered her voice. I know exactly who to call. Rebecca filed the petition 2 days before the new year. Tennessee Code Annotated Section 36360-1 Financial Abuse. Coercive control. Isolation. Rebecca had spent 3 days building the filing after I delivered copies of the phone records showing the pattern of monitored calls, Brenda Cole's written statement, and Julie's description of the signed document, the medical records from Julie's workplace visit, the ones that noted bruising consistent with gripping on her right wrist, went in as a supporting exhibit. I paid an additional $2. 800 inches legal fees. Running total. Lumayan. Sambe. I noted it in the notebook under the heading Expenses. Boyd case. I've spent more on less. 3 days into the new year. The IRS opened a formal criminal investigation. Dennis left a brief message on my landline. A number he had for the house, which I hadn't given him, and which I found faintly admirable in a professional sense. The message said only that the matter had moved to the next stage, and that I'd received no further direct communication from him on it, which was exactly what I expected. The accounts of Boyd Construction LLC, Summit Builds LLC, and Crest Contracting LLC were administratively frozen pending review. Terry's response to all of this arrived within 48 hours. Routed through Marcus Webb. The offer was $45. Lang. A check issued to Leonard Wells in exchange for withdrawing cooperation from any ongoing investigation and encouraging Julie to decline further representation from Rebecca Simmons. The letter was courteous, professional, and gave 3 business days for a response. I read it twice. I looked at the number. Then I called Rebecca and told her what to send back. Her response on my behalf was one sentence. Mr. Boyd, my client is not available for purchase. I thought that was well put. The freeze on Terry's accounts had an effect I hadn't entirely anticipated. Or rather, one I'd anticipated but hadn't expected to see quite so quickly. The rental payment for the Elm Hill Pike townhouse was 2 weeks behind before Marcus Webb's letter had even arrived on my desk. The landlord, I would later learn, had sent a formal notice. Terry's access to the LLC accounts was the source of the cash he used for daily expenses. And without it, he was running on personal reserves that were, apparently, considerably thinner than he'd projected. A desperate man makes different decisions than a comfortable one. I've seen it at border crossings. Cargo that had been moving through cleanly for years gets sloppy the moment the operator starts feeling pressure. Details get missed. Patterns get broken. Choices get made that the same person would never have made otherwise. Terry's desperate decision arrived in my text messages on the evening before the Davidson County hearing date. The number wasn't one I recognized. The message was 7 words. Back off or you will regret this. I read it 3 times. I took a screenshot. I forwarded it to both Rebecca and Dennis with the same note. Received this evening. Preserving original. Then I put the phone down and made coffee. The following morning, Rebecca called. This changes things. She said, witness, tampering or intimidation, even implied, becomes an independent count. It also undermines any claim that his actions toward Julie were misunderstood or benign. I assumed so. I said, the hearing is tomorrow. This message goes in front of the judge. Rebecca asked whether I was prepared to appear and speak to the overall pattern of conduct. I said I was. She said to be at the courthouse by 9:00. I wrote it in the notebook. Davidson County Courthouse. 9:00 M. I put on a pot of coffee. Julie was in the kitchen when I came downstairs that evening. She'd been staying in the guest room since Christmas night. She hadn't gone back to the townhouse. Terry had texted her twice. She'd shown me both messages and then, after reading them, blocked the number. That had been her decision. Not mine. And I was glad of it. Rebecca says the hearing is tomorrow. Jiulingling. She nodded. She poured a cup from the pot and stood by the window looking at the street. The lights were on down the block at Dennis's house. Are you nervous? She asked. I thought about it. Honestly, no. I said, I've done everything I can do from my end. The rest is paperwork. She gave me a look that suggested she found this characterization slightly inadequate. I poured my own coffee. Terry's accounts are frozen. I said, his mother is under the same investigation. He sent an idiotic message last night that Rebecca is going to hand to the judge tomorrow morning. He is in the position of a man who has been building a structure for years and has just discovered that the foundation was not what he thought. I glanced at the map room doorway. Some routes look passable until you're already committed to them. I said. Julie was quiet for a moment. Then, from somewhere under the exhaustion and the uncertainty, and 2 years of careful, controlled expression, she produced the slightly crooked smile, the one I hadn't seen in 2 years. You're enjoying this, she said. A little. I said, yes. She shook her head, but the smile stayed. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. But I'd done longer in worse conditions with less documentation. I finished my coffee and went to check the notebook one more time. Rebecca had told me to be at the courthouse by 9:00. I was there at 8:40, which is a habit I've never managed to break. I found a seat in the hallway outside the Davidson County courtroom, set my notebook on my knee, and waited. Julie sat beside me. She was wearing a dark blazer and had her hair down, which meant she'd made a decision about how she wanted to present herself. I noted that without saying anything about it, Rebecca arrived at 8:55 with a leather folio under her arm. She gave us both a brief nod. The nod of a person who has done this before and has the particular calm that comes from preparation rather than indifference. She leaned in and told us that she'd received confirmation that morning. The threatening text message had been traced to a prepaid phone registered to a name that appeared in 2 of the 3 LLC filings as a secondary contact. A cousin on Christine Boyd's side. So it ties back to Christine, I said. The connection is sufficient for the judge. Rebecca said, it establishes a coordinated effort to intimidate a witness. That's a separate count from the financial matters. It helps us considerably. She went inside. We waited. The hearing lasted an hour and 20 minutes. Courtrooms are mostly slow and procedural. They involve a lot of paper passing between people. What I can tell you is what Rebecca filed in front of the judge. 47 pages of financial documentation. Brenda Cole's written statement describing the marks on Julie's wrist and the controlled conditions of her daily life. Medical records from a workplace visit documenting bruising consistent with gripping on the right wrist. A copy of the LLC document Julie had signed with her declaration explaining the circumstances, and the screenshot of the threatening message with the registration trace attached The judge reviewed each exhibit without visible reaction. She asked Rebecca 3 questions and Terry's attorney, Marcus Webb. Tue. Webb's answers were the answers of a man who had come expecting to negotiate and found there was nothing left to negotiate. At the end of the hearing, the judge issued a protective order against Terry Boyd, prohibiting contact with Julie. She issued a temporary order removing Terry's access to any jointly held assets and referred the financial coercion findings to the Davidson County DA's office, and she noted on the record that the threatening message constituted potential witness intimidation and was being referred for separate consideration. Terry was in the courtroom. He sat at the table with Marcus Webb, looking for the first time smaller than the chair he was sitting in. His hands were flat on the table. He didn't look at Julie. He didn't look at me. I watched him the way I used to watch people at the border. Not with hostility, just attention. He was recalculating. He wasn't finished. Men like Terry are never finished until there is no room left to maneuver. But the room was getting smaller. We left the courthouse just after 11:00. Julie stood on the front steps in the cold air and said, "He's going to post bail and try something else. He has frozen accounts. A federal criminal investigation. A protective order. A DA referral. And a mother under the same review." I said, "What exactly does he have left to try something with?" She was quiet a moment. "He's going to lose the business. He lost it when the accounts froze." I said, "He's just the last to know." 3 days later, Rebecca called with an update. IRS criminal investigation had formally expanded the scope of the review to include Christine Boyd's personal accounts. The $74.00 consulting fees paid to Christine from Summit Builds and Crest Contracting over 3 years was now under direct scrutiny. Rebecca's assistant had contacted me earlier that week to say that Terry's formal arrest processing, following the DA referral, would require a bail hearing. The bail was set at $380. Ling ling ling. Terry did not post it that day. Julie was in the kitchen when I got off the phone. She'd been staying in the guest room since Christmas night and had, over the past 2 weeks, quietly begun filling the space. A coffee mug on the second shelf, a phone charger on the counter, a book on the small table near the window. She looked up when I came in. "Christine left Nashville this morning." I said. Rebecca's contact confirmed it. She drove back to Murfreesboro. Julie wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "She's going to make a deal." She said, "That would be my guess." I said, "I put the kettle on." Julie watched the street through the kitchen window. After a while, she said quietly, "Dad, I didn't know you were doing any of this." I got a cup from the cabinet. "I know." I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about how to answer that honestly, because I wasn't sure how much time I had. I said, "And because telling you would have put you in a position of knowing, which would have put you at risk." I paused. "I'm a customs inspector for 31 years. Nobody knew what I was looking at until I'd finished looking." She was quiet for a long moment. "A federal grand jury is going to review the tax case." I said, "The total underpayment across the 3 fiscal years is $214. Ling ling ling. That carries up to 5 years. Whatever deal Christine makes, it won't cover him." Julie set her cup down. She looked at me with an expression I didn't entirely have a word for. Something between relief and the specific exhaustion of a person who's been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been allowed to put it down. "You knew how this was going to end." She said, "I knew how I wanted it to end." I said, "I planned accordingly." 3 weeks into the new year, the federal grand jury handed down an indictment against Terry Boyd on 3 counts. Tax evasion, totaling $214. Ling ling ling, fraudulent subcontracting, and witness intimidation. Each count carried separate sentencing exposure. Marcus Webb issued a statement through his office that his client intended to contest the charges. Attorneys say that it doesn't change what the documents say. Christine Boyd entered a cooperation agreement the following week. She returned $74,000 to the IRS, agreed to testify regarding the structure of the shell companies, and received a suspended sentence. She drove back to Murfreesboro and, as far as I know, has not returned to Nashville. Julie filed for divorce through Rebecca Simmons. With Terry's accounts frozen and his formal arrest on record, the proceedings moved without significant obstruction. Rebecca told us it was one of the more straightforward cases she'd handled in terms of asset discovery. For reasons that were apparent to everyone in the room, a few days after the filing, I went upstairs to the map room. I took the 1,847 Tennessee survey off the shelf and moved it to a higher position where it would be visible from the hallway. Julie came to the doorway. "What's that one?" she asked. "Tennessee. 1847. Before most of the development, before everything got built on top of everything else." She looked at it for a moment. "It looks different. It shows the land before someone built something on it that didn't belong there." I said, "Now it's clean again." She came into the room and stood beside me. Then she put her arms around me briefly without saying anything. I put one hand on her shoulder. Outside the window, Nashville was gray and cold, and exactly where it had always been. Some things don't need changing. Some things just need the obstruction removed. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.